Hello, everyone. I am the Sleeper Man, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel also. Where are you from? And what time are you watching now? Get comfortable and relax. What if I told you a single rainy night at a truck yard led to one of the creepiest real-life encounters ever? In this video, he'll share how an ordinary patrol turned into a terrifying confrontation with the past. Stick around to find out what was left behind and why it still haunts me to this day. You won't believe how it ends. It was a freezing December night in 2009. One of those nights where you could feel the cold biting through your skin, no matter how bundled up you were. I was working the yard during the aero trucking shutdown, a time when everything felt more eerie than usual. There were only 7 trucks parked in the lot that night, the engines silent and the wind howling through the rows of trailers. I was alone, patrolling the grounds like I'd done 1,000 times before. But something about that night, that place, didn't sit right with me. As I made my way past the rows of parked rigs, I noticed a Kenworth sitting at the far end of the yard. Its front end gleamed under the dim yard lights, and on the side of the cab, a Palmia insignia was visible. I had passed this truck before, but tonight, something was different. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached. It wasn't just the cold, it was something else. Something unsettling. My instincts kicked in when I spotted movement near the truck. A man, early 30s maybe, was walking toward the Kenworth. He didn't seem to notice me at first. The man moved slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. He was dressed in what looked like a military uniform, something I'd seen in old photos of my father from Vietnam. My heart began to race. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but something felt off. I pulled my baton from its holder and extended it. "Hey!" I called out, my voice barely carrying over the wind. "Step away from the truck." He stopped, turned his head and looked straight at me. There was something in his eyes, an emptiness that made my stomach twist. He didn't seem startled or concerned by my presence, just sad. Slowly, his gaze dropped to the step of the truck, where something caught his attention. I raised the baton, motioning for him to back away. Instead of complying, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. But the thing is, he didn't just walk off into the yard. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, vanished. Just like that. I stood frozen, my mind trying to rationalize what had just happened. Had the shadows swallowed him up? Had I imagined the whole thing? My hand gripping the baton was trembling as I approached the Kenworth. The wind whistled through the trailers, the only sound breaking the silence of the night. I reached the truck, cautiously stepping up onto the metal step where the man had been standing. That's when I saw them 2 patches, a Palmia patch and another belonging to the famous 7th Cavalry. I crouched down, picking them up. They felt real, solid, not something my mind had conjured out of fear. The patches were old, worn from time, but unmistakably real. My heart pounded in my chest as I examined them in the pale light of the yard. Who was that man? Why had he placed these here? I couldn't shake the image of his empty eyes, his military uniform so reminiscent of my father's. It felt like I was holding a piece of someone's life, a story untold, a narrative too terrifying to comprehend. I stood there for what felt like hours, my fingers tightening around the patches. The cold metal of the truck step beneath my boots was a sharp reminder that this wasn't some nightmare I could wake up from. Everything was too real, the icy wind cutting through the yard, the patches in my hand, and the haunting image of that man's face. For a moment, I thought about calling it in, telling someone about what I had just seen, but who would believe me? It sounded like something out of those scary stories you hear around a campfire, not a true story that could happen in the middle of a freezing truck yard. I started to walk back toward the yard office, my breath coming out in short, foggy puffs, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. My mind kept replaying the man's expression, the way he had looked at the truck like it held some deep, personal meaning to him. His military uniform, those patches, why did they feel so familiar? The emptiness in his eyes reminded me of something I couldn't place. It was as if he wasn't all there, like he'd left a part of himself behind a long time ago. As I reached the edge of the lot, I paused. I glanced back at the Kenworth, half expecting to see him standing there again, his figure illuminated by the pale yard lights. But there was nothing, just the trucks, lined up in the stillness, the rain beginning to drizzle lightly on the pavement. The sound of raindrops tapping on metal filled the silence, almost like a soft sleep aid, something meant to lull me into a false sense of security. But this wasn't relaxing. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel alone in the worst way, like you're the last person on earth, trapped in a nightmare you can't wake up from. I turned away and headed for the small office where I'd been stationed for the night. It was barely more than a shed with a couple of chairs and a small desk where I could do my paperwork. The rain was picking up now, tapping harder against the roof. I tried to busy myself, logging the time I'd spent patrolling the lot, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept glancing toward the window, expecting to see something, anything that might explain what I had just experienced. But there was only darkness, the rain beating down and the occasional hum of a distant engine. My mind wouldn't let go of those patches. They felt like a piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve, something that tied that man to this place. I sat down, staring at them on the desk in front of me, my thoughts racing. The 7th Cavalry was well known, steeped in military history. Why would a trucker and aero driver no less have these patches? More importantly, why would a man wearing a uniform from decades past show up here, tonight, in the middle of this empty yard? I reached for the radio to report the sighting, but stopped. The last thing I wanted was for my co-workers to think I'd lost it. I could already imagine the jokes. This wasn't some relaxing horror story meant to spook people before bed. This was something else, something real, and it was happening now. I glanced at the patches again, their edges worn and frayed, as if they had seen more than just their fair share of battle. The more I stared, the more I felt like they were staring back at me, pulling me deeper into a mystery I didn't want to solve. I couldn't sit still any longer. The rain had turned into a steady downpour, the rhythmic drumming against the roof almost deafening in the silence of the office. I needed answers. Those patches, that man there had to be a connection to aero trucking, but I didn't know where to start. My father had always told me stories about the men he served with, the ones who came back home but never really came back. Maybe this was one of those men, trapped between two worlds, carrying the weight of whatever happened in the past. I grabbed the patches and stuffed them into my jacket pocket before heading back out into the yard. The rain soaked through my clothes almost immediately, but I didn't care. I needed to see that Kenworth again, needed to understand why this truck had drawn that man to it. As I approached, the rain sounds drowned out everything else, turning the world around me into a wet, distorted version of reality. The headlights of the Kenworth reflected the dim yard lights, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. When I reached the truck, I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I was even looking for. But then, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The driver's side door was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled it open further, the creaking sound barely audible over the rain. The interior of the cab was empty, save for a few personal items, a coffee mug, a pair of boots tossed carelessly on the floor, and an old photograph wedged into the visor. I hesitated before reaching for the photo, my fingers shaking as I pulled it down. It was an old black and white picture, faded around the edges. In the photo, a man in a military uniform stood proudly in front of a helicopter, his arms crossed over his chest. It was the same man I'd seen earlier, no doubt about it. The same empty expression, the same uniform, except in the picture, there was something different in his eyes. There was pride, confidence, but still that emptiness lingered, like he was already preparing himself for something terrible. I flipped the photo over and found writing on the back in neat, precise handwriting. For my brothers, 7th Cavalry, 1968. Never forget. My stomach tightened. 1968, that was Vietnam. My father had told me about the horrors of that war, the men who never came back the same. Was this truck somehow connected to that past? I didn't know much about the drivers who worked for aero trucking, but this man, this soldier, felt like he didn't belong in this time, in this place. It was as if he had been pulled from his past and placed here, waiting for something. I climbed into the cab, ignoring the rain dripping from my clothes, and sat there for a moment staring at the photo. The patches in my pocket felt heavier now, like they were demanding my attention. This wasn't just another scary truck tale. This was something more. I felt like I had stepped into the middle of a story that had started long before I was even born, and now I was being asked to carry it forward, to understand what had happened to this man and why he had chosen this night, this truck, to return. I sat there in the cab, soaked to the bone, the photograph trembling in my hand. My mind raced, trying to piece everything together. The rain hadn't let up, and the steady rhythm felt like a clock, counting down to something I didn't want to face. This wasn't just about a ghost sighting. The patches, the photo, the man, they were all pieces of a history that was still unfolding, and somehow I was tangled up in it. I had no idea why. The patches in my pocket seemed to burn against my skin, urging me to act. I pulled them out and placed them next to the photograph. The 7th Cavalry patch looked old, worn from years of wear and tear. The POB patch, though, looked newer, like it had been added later, after years of silent grief. The more I stared at them, the more I felt like I was intruding on something sacred, something I had no right to be part of, but I couldn't stop now. There was a pull, a deep sense that this story hadn't reached its end, not yet. Suddenly, a loud knock on the window jolted me out of my thoughts. I whipped around, my heart pounding in my chest. Standing there, illuminated by the yard lights, was the man again, the soldier. His face was still empty, but there was something different this time, something urgent in his expression. Without thinking, I opened the door and stepped out into the pouring rain. My eyes locked on his. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but he gestured toward the truck with a slow, deliberate motion. It was as if he wanted me to drive. I hesitated, unsure of what to do, but the intensity in his gaze was impossible to ignore. I climbed back into the truck, my hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. The cab felt colder now, the air thick with something I couldn't name. The soldier remained outside, staring at me through the rain, his figure barely visible in the dim light. I turned the ignition and the truck roared to life, the vibrations shaking through my entire body. The sound of the engine seemed to drown out the rain for a moment, creating a strange sense of isolation. I didn't know where I was supposed to go, but I knew I had to move. Slowly, I pulled the truck forward, my eyes glued to the figure outside. As I drove, the soldier began to walk alongside the truck, his movement steady and calm, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. The yard faded into the background, and soon, the road stretched out before me, the rain-slicked pavement gleaming under the headlights. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was retracing someone else's steps, driving a route that had been traveled long ago. The road seemed endless, the rain never letting up, but the soldier kept pace, his presence a constant haunting reminder of the past. I drove for what felt like hours, the tension building in my chest with every mile. And then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the soldier stopped. I hit the brakes, the truck skidding slightly on the wet road. I turned to look at him, but he was gone, just like that, vanished into the rain. I sat there in the driver's seat, my heart pounding in the silence. The patches were still in my pocket, the photograph still on the seat next to me, but the soldier was gone, and the road ahead was empty. I didn't know what had just happened, didn't know why I had been chosen to carry this weight, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just another scary truck tale or nighttime truck story to be told and forgotten. This was real, and it had ended the way it had begun, with silence and unanswered questions. I turned the truck around and headed back to the yard, the rain still pouring down, the engine humming softly beneath me. As I pulled into the yard, everything looked the same as before, but I knew I'd never see it the same way again. That man, that soldier, he had found some kind of peace tonight, and for reasons I did never understand, I had been a part of it. As I shut off the engine and stepped out into the rain, I couldn't help but wonder how many more true stories like this were out there, waiting in the dark, waiting for someone like me to stumble across them. Maybe this was just one in a long line of scary stories passed down through time. Or maybe it was the kind of relaxing horror that people told themselves to make sense of the unexplainable. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I'd never forget this night, not as long as I lived. Did you know that one night on the road can change everything? This video dives into the true story of a truck driver navigating through a terrifying tornado outbreak, where an encounter with a ghostly blue truck might have been the key to survival. If you think you know what happened next, Think again, this story reveals shocking twists that could haunt you long after the credits roll. There's something about driving through a storm that gets to you. The way the rain sounds as it pounds the windshield, mixing with the roar of the engine. It's like it's trying to drown out everything else, every thought, every worry, every fear. That night, June 18th, 1974, it was worse than usual. I was behind the wheel of my A-model Kenworth, fighting my way westward through one of the worst storms I'd ever seen. The hail came down so hard it sounded like gunfire on the roof, and the rain, it was like someone had turned a fire hose on full blast and aimed it straight at my truck. The CB was alive with warnings, but I had 75 hours to make my run, and stopping wasn't an option, not if I wanted to get back to Greeley on time. Crossing the Mississippi felt like I was heading straight into hell. The tornado warnings kept popping up on the radio, and the reports of destruction were constant. Ankeny had been leveled, and no one knew how many lives were lost. But I had a schedule to keep, and the faster I got to Omaha, the sooner I could hand the wheel over to my co-driver. Still, every now and then, doubt would creep in, gnawing at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't shake loose. Would it really be worth it to push on through? It wasn't just my life at risk. I had my co-driver asleep in the back, but I'd been doing this long enough to know that sometimes you just have to keep going. The storm let up by the time I hit Stewart, Iowa, but the road was still slick, reflecting the eerie glow of my headlights as I tore down the interstate. The lack of eastbound traffic struck me as odd. It's like everyone else knew something I didn't. My speed crept back up as the adrenaline finally started to wear off, and that's when I made my mistake. I was too relaxed. The fight to stay awake became too real. My eyes fluttered shut for just a second, and the next thing I knew, I was jerking awake, slapping myself in the face to stay alert. My speedometer showed 70, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw something coming up behind me. It was a truck, gaining on me fast. I couldn't tell what kind of rig it was right away, just the headlights bobbing up and down over the hills. My Kenworth was fast, but whatever was coming had me beat. As it came closer, I caught a glimpse of the metallic blue paint, and I realized it had to be an old B-model Mack, chromed out and roaring past like a jetliner. The exhaust pipes had small blue flames licking out of the tips, and as it passed, the sound of its engine was like nothing I'd heard before. I floored the throttle, trying to keep up, but my 350 Cummins just didn't have the power to match that beast. I watched as the Mack crested the next hill, its brake lights flaring up for a moment before disappearing into the night. What the hell did he see? I thought. My foot instinctively eased off the gas, slowing down as I approached the hill. The moment I crested it, my blood went cold. There, lying across the road, was a livestock truck flipped on its side. Hogs scattered across the asphalt like lifeless bodies in the beam of my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. The Mack had seen it. It had to have. But when I looked around, the road was empty. Truck squealed to a stop, tires sliding on the wet pavement as I desperately tried to avoid the wreckage. My headlights illuminated the carnage in front of me, dead hogs scattered like debris from a war zone. For a split second, my mind played tricks on me. In the half-light, those bodies looked too human. I shook it off and slapped on my four-ways, realizing that if any other vehicles came over that hill, they wouldn't have a chance to stop in time. I should have woken my co-driver, but I was on autopilot now, adrenaline coursing through me. I lit 2 of the flares I had in the cab and sprinted down the road, frantically waving them to warn any oncoming traffic. The rain kept coming, softer now, but still loud enough to drown out most other sounds except the crackle of the flares and the low groan of the wind. Finally, headlights appeared from the east station wagon. A mom, dad, and 3 kids asleep in the back. They screeched to a halt just before hitting the wreckage, the mother jumping out as soon as the car stopped. She rushed toward me, panic in her eyes. "I'm a nurse. Can I help? Is anyone hurt?" "I don't know where the driver is," I stammered, pointing toward the wrecked cab. "He's gotta be somewhere." Without a word, she darted into the darkness, moving toward the crumpled remains of the cab like a soldier heading into battle. I held my breath as she disappeared from view. The moments dragged on, and when she reappeared, her face told me everything I needed to know. She didn't have to say a word. The driver was gone. Just then, a pair of flashing lights appeared in the distance, heading our way. It was one of those big Chrysler Iowa State Patrol cruisers, and the officer used his spotlight to scan the scene as he approached. Relief washed over me as backup finally arrived. The officer got out and started assessing the situation, asking what had happened, if there were any other cars involved. I explained how I'd come over the hill and seen the livestock truck, barely stopping in time. I told him about the blue Mac that had passed me just minutes before, how it hit the brakes and saved my life by warning me of the danger ahead. That's when the officer's face changed. "The truck ahead of you?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I nodded. "It passed me just before I crested the hill. I saw its brake lights. That's why I slowed down." The officer stared at me for a moment, then glanced back at the road behind us. "Son, I haven't seen any other trucks out here for hours. There's been no traffic coming from the east since the storm passed." A cold chill ran up my spine. "That can't be," I stammered. I saw it plain as day. Blue Mac, chromed out, old icebox trailer. It was real. The officer shook his head and walked back to his cruiser, using the spotlight to scan the area. He was looking for wreckage, probably thinking the Mac had gone off the road and crashed somewhere in the darkness. But there was nothing, just rain-soaked fields and that eerie silence that comes after a storm. I stood there, staring at the spot where the Mac should have been, but there was no trace of it. Nothing. The livestock wreck was bad, but it wasn't blocking the road that much. That truck should have been sitting here just like I was, but it was gone. The officer came back, shrugging. "I can't find anything. Maybe you imagined it. But whatever the case, you saved a lot of lives tonight by stopping traffic." But I didn't save anyone. That Mac, whatever it was, saved me. The more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. The chrome, the blue flames from the pipes, the old icebox trailer. They hadn't used those trailers in years. I asked the vacationing family if they had seen a truck pass them before they stopped. "You're the first truck we've seen in hours," the mom replied, her voice shaky. I felt a lump rise in my throat. She looked at me with gratitude, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you for saving our lives." I glanced into the back seat at the kids, still fast asleep, blissfully unaware of the horror that had nearly unfolded. I couldn't tell her what I knew, that I had nothing to do with it. It was that ghost truck, whatever it was, that had warned me. I didn't save anyone, but as I climbed back into my cab, one thought haunted me. Where did that truck go? As the rain sounds faded into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just encountered something beyond explanation. Maybe it was one of those stories, one of those true trucker horror stories you hear, whispered at truck stops. A bedtime story meant to keep you awake on those lonely nighttime runs. But I wasn't asleep, and this was real. It was nearly midnight when I finally left the wreckage behind and continued my journey on the slick, deserted highway. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, casting a mist over everything, but the adrenaline still buzzed in my veins. I kept replaying the evening's events in my mind, the wreck, the blue Mac, and that haunting realization that it had disappeared. I switched on the radio to drown out my thoughts, but the static only amplified my unease. It was quiet, too quiet. As I drove through the darkness, the wet pavement shimmered under the weak beams of my headlights. I could feel the weight of the night pressing down, making the truck feel smaller, more vulnerable. Each time I glanced in my mirrors, I half expected to see the ghostly blue Mac trailing behind me, but there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road, winding into the gloom. As I passed through a small town, the faint glow of a diner flickered in the distance. I considered stopping for a cup of coffee, maybe some comfort in this strange night, but the memory of the wreck kept me moving. Miles melted away under my tires, and just as I thought I'd calmed my racing heart, a flash of light caught my eye. A bright beam illuminated the road ahead, flickering in and out like a dying star. I slowed down, squinting into the darkness. Was it the blue Mac? As I got closer, I realized it was just a solitary streetlight, swinging on its rusted chain, casting eerie shadows. I felt a wave of relief wash over me until I noticed something else, a figure standing near the light, half in the shadows. My gut twisted. It was a person, standing alone in the rain. What were they doing out here? I eased the truck to a stop, weighing my options. Do I help? I thought. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, but the image of the family from earlier flickered in my mind. What if this was someone who needed help? I reached for the CB radio, but before I could make a call, the figure stepped into the light. My heart dropped. It was a woman, drenched and disheveled, with long hair matted against her face. Her clothes hung loosely on her thin frame, and as she raised her head to look at me, her eyes were wide, almost vacant, and yet she seemed to beckon me closer. "Help me," she mouthed, though no sound escaped her lips. A sick feeling churned in my stomach. I should have driven on. I should have ignored her, but something compelled me to open the door and step out. "What happened?" I shouted over the rain. The wind carried her whisper away, but she pointed down the road past the streetlight into the darkness. My baby's lost," she said, her voice barely audible. "Please, help me find him." The air felt charged. "Where did you last see him?" I asked, my heart racing. She didn't answer, only stared into the darkness, eyes wide and desperate. "Lady, where are we supposed to look?" I shouted, but the words felt hollow as they hung in the air. Suddenly the hair on my arm stood on end. I heard something, a faint sound behind me, like the roar of an engine. I turned my head, glancing back toward the highway, and when I looked again, she was gone, just vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the echo of her plea hanging in the rain-soaked night. My breath hitched in my throat. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, half expecting her to reappear. I stepped back toward the truck, but my instincts screamed that I should get out of here. Something was off, and I could feel it deep in my bones. As I climbed back into the cab, I caught a glimpse of headlights approaching in the distance. I didn't wait to see what it was. I floored the throttle, eager to put distance between myself and that strange encounter. My heart raced as I focused on the road ahead, my mind still trying to grasp what had just happened. As I drove on, the CB crackled to life, breaking the silence. "Anyone out there?" The voice was shaky, filled with static. "There's something on the road ahead, something not right. It's dark, and I don't know how to explain it." I grabbed the mic, my voice tight. "What do you see?" Just a woman," the voice quivered. "She keeps asking for help. She's out there, in the rain, and it doesn't feel right, like something's watching." The chill returned, wrapping around my spine. "Get out of there, man. Do not stop," I shouted, but the radio went silent, static filling the void. A knot formed in my stomach as I kept driving, straining to see past the beam of my headlights. The rain had picked up again, pounding against the windshield like a warning. Was the Blue Mac out there too? I felt a flicker of hope and dread. Was it just me, or were we all somehow tied to this nightmare? As the hours dragged on, the road stretched endlessly before me, but I could still hear that woman's whisper echoing in my mind. I pushed the truck to its limits, desperate to reach safety, but the haunting images lingered, dancing in the shadows of my thoughts. What had I truly encountered on that rain-slicked road? Maybe this was just another one of those true trucker horror stories, yet another tale to be shared in hushed tones at the roadside diners, serving as a warning for those who dared to venture out at night. But as I drove into the unknown, the night held its secrets close, and the shadows seemed to reach for me, reminding me that sometimes it's better not to know what lurks just out of sight. As dawn approached, the storm had finally abated, leaving behind a glistening road and a sense of eerie calm. I could feel my eyes growing heavy with fatigue, but I had to keep going. The events of the night weighed on me like lead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, waiting. I switched on the radio again, hoping for a distraction, but all I got was static and the occasional crackle of a distant trucker. "Anyone got a copy?" the voice called. It sounded shaky, the words laden with urgency. "Be advised, there's been a strange sighting on Highway 70, just past the rest area. Something's not right." I swear, I straightened up in my seat, alert now. "What do you mean, strange?" I asked, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Some guy reported seeing a phantom truck, like it's just gliding along the road. No noise, just there, like it's moving but not moving, if you catch my drift." My heart raced. Was this the same Blue Mac I had seen? Could it be a figment of my imagination, or was there something more sinister at play? The radio crackled again, interrupting my thoughts. Watch out for that rest area. Some folks have gone missing after stopping there. That was all I needed to hear. I resolved to skip the rest area entirely. I didn't want to end up another ghost story shared among truckers during late-night hauls, but as I continued down the highway, the allure of rest became stronger, gnawing at me like a persistent itch. I needed to stop and stretch my legs, but I had a sinking feeling that rest wasn't what I would find there. The thought of that woman's vacant eyes and the echo of her plea haunted me. I considered the risks, but I also knew that fatigue could be just as dangerous as the supernatural. Against my better judgment, I pulled into the rest area. The asphalt was slick, reflecting the first hints of sunlight filtering through the clouds. The whole place felt desolate, an eerie stillness hanging in the air. I stepped out of the truck, the smell of rain mingling with the exhaust fumes. I moved toward the restrooms, half expecting to see the woman again. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around, but the place was empty. Just me and the silence. The restroom door creaked as I pushed it open, and I hurried inside. I was washing my hands when I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past the door. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the entrance. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer, just the sound of the water dripping from the faucet. I finished up quickly, wiping my hands on my jeans. As I stepped out of the restroom, a chill ran down my spine. The parking lot was empty. "This is ridiculous," I thought, shaking my head. "Get back on the road." Just as I turned to head back to my truck, I heard a faint sound, a low rumble, like an engine. I turned, my heart racing. In the distance, a truck appeared, gliding toward me in the mist. The familiar blue hue made my pulse quicken. Could it be the Mac from last night? As it drew closer, I noticed something was off. The truck seemed almost translucent, its edges blurred as if it were part of the fog itself. I squinted, trying to make out the details, but they eluded me. It rolled past me in a ghostly silence, headlights shining bright but devoid of sound. "Hey!" I shouted, instinctively stepping toward it. But it didn't stop. It just passed by, fading into the mist like a wisp of smoke. Panic gripped me. Was I losing my mind? Suddenly, I felt a tug at my shirt. I spun around, but no one was there. The rest area felt alive with whispers, the trees rustling as if sharing secrets. "No, no, no," I whispered to myself, backing away slowly. The phantom truck had vanished, and I was left alone in the surreal quiet. I hurried back to my Kenworth, adrenaline coursing through me. The engine purred to life, and I took off, eager to leave the rest area behind. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being pursued. My headlights cut through the morning fog, but my mind was trapped in the darkness of the night. As I hit the highway again, I tuned back into the radio, hoping for some connection to reality. "Anyone out there?" The voice crackled. "You won't believe what just happened. I saw a truck without a driver, a blue Mac, heading toward the rest area. Is anyone else seeing this?" My breath hitched in my throat. "Oh God," I murmured. "Stay safe out there," the voice continued, urgency mounting. "There's something off about these roads. I've been hearing stories, ghosts, missing drivers, just be careful." The hairs on my neck prickled as I thought of that woman, and the haunting memory of her pleas. I pressed on, determined to reach my destination, but the shadows lingered in my mind. As I crossed into the next state, the sunlight began to break through the clouds, illuminating the road ahead. But the darkness of the night felt far from over. It seemed that I had become part of the very fabric of those true trucker horror stories that circulated among drivers, each tale woven with a thread of fear and uncertainty. What else was waiting on these lonely highways? What other chilling narratives lurked in the corners of the mind? As I drove on, I knew I was not alone, and the road ahead was anything but predictable. It was April 8, 1979, and the rain was coming down in sheets, drumming against the windshield of my truck as I rolled into Newburgh, New York. I pulled into the all-night diner, a familiar stop on my long hauls, where the neon lights buzzed like tired bees. The air inside was thick with the smell of garlic and coffee that could wake the dead strong enough to strip paint off a wall, and I needed that jolt tonight. I was still nursing memories of the war, the kind that had a way of creeping up on you like a shadow in the night. I had come back from Vietnam years ago, but the ghosts of that place lingered longer than I cared to admit. I settled into a booth in the corner, the vinyl squeaking beneath me as I pulled out my notebook. I had an appointment in Red Hook early the next morning, giving me a few hours to unwind and maybe get some sleep before hitting the road again. I watched as the diner buzzed with the usual crowd of truckers and late-night diners, the sounds of clattering plates and murmured conversations blending with the rhythmic rain sounds outside. Then, almost out of nowhere, I noticed a young Marine in the last booth, his hands folded neatly on the table. It struck me as odd. I could have sworn I'd been alone just moments ago. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, surprising myself with the boldness. The kid's eyes lit up, and he motioned for me to sit. As I slid into the booth, I couldn't help but admire the ribbons on his chest, a testament to a life I knew all too well. 4 rows of medals glimmered under the diner's harsh lights, each telling a story of valor and sacrifice. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" I commented, feeling the weight of those medals hanging in the air between us. He nodded, his expression shifting as he recounted tales of Khe Sanh and the fierce battles that raged there. The room around us faded. The clatter of silverware dulled to a background hum as he spoke. I listened intently, reliving moments I thought I'd buried deep within. I was at Hugh, I shared, wanting him to know I understood. The moment I said it, I saw his gaze shift, a mix of recognition and sorrow passing over his face. It was a connection forged in fire, the kind you rarely find outside the war. As we swapped stories, the atmosphere in the diner shifted. I noticed other truckers coming and going, but the Marine seemed lost in his thoughts. His attention suddenly snapped to an old driver at the counter who had begun to cough violently. I could see the concern in the Marine's eyes as he watched, almost as if he recognized the struggle in that man's breath. When the old driver finally left, the diner returned to its usual rhythm, but the Marine's focus remained distant. Hours slipped by, and I found myself fascinated by this young man. Yet I was equally aware that I didn't even know his name. After a moment of silence, I introduced myself, and he responded, but his name felt weighty and significant, almost like an anchor for our conversation. As I jotted down my contact information on a napkin, I felt an urge to reach out, to offer support in whatever way I could. But just as I was about to leave, he urged me to stay a bit longer, a hint of urgency in his tone. "Not yet, sir. Please, just a few more minutes," he insisted, his eyes darting toward the diner's entrance. The rain had intensified outside, forming rivers along the cracked pavement. The diner was now shrouded in a curtain of water, the lights flickering as the storm raged. I leaned back, curiosity gnawing at me. "You waiting for someone?" I asked, wanting to fill the silence. The Marine's gaze drifted toward the window, his expression becoming solemn. "Yes," he said quietly. "I made a promise to a friend. We were supposed to meet here on this date." There was a weight to his words, and I felt the air grow thick with unspoken history. I glanced around the nearly empty diner, the only sounds now being the rhythm of the rain and the clinking of dishes in the kitchen. I wanted to press him for more details, but something told me that this moment was sacred, that he was recounting a chapter of his life he had kept buried. "What happened?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was the anniversary of our rescue from Khe Sanh," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. "We were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in that airbase for days. When we finally got the call to leave, we lost so many good men." His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and I felt a pang of empathy for him, a stranger sharing his burden with me. The waitress came by with a fresh pot of coffee, filling our cups as she shot us a curious glance. I was about to say something to break the tension when I noticed him stiffen, his eyes glued to the entrance. My heart raced as I turned to see an elderly driver enter, water dripping from his slicker, his face pale and drawn. He shuffled toward the counter, barely able to catch his breath, and the Marine's expression changed. "Stay," he whispered, urgently. I leaned closer, my heart pounding as I observed the old man. He sat down and immediately began to cough again, choking violently on the air. The Marine's eyes darted between me and the elderly driver, his body tense, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. It was as if he was reliving a moment from the past, one that had left a mark on him that time could not erase. "Sir, are you all right?" I called out, the worry creeping into my voice. The old man waved me off, his face reddening. The Marine's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, almost as if he could will the man to recover. I could feel the desperation radiating off him, and it sent chills down my spine. Finally, the old man stopped coughing, gasping for air. He paid his bill, oblivious to the concern etched on the Marine's face. As he left, I glanced back at my companion, who seemed lost in thought, his gaze following the driver out the door. "What's wrong?" I asked, feeling a sense of foreboding settle in my stomach. "This has one of them," the Marine muttered, shaking his head. "I didn't save him." The anguish in his voice was palpable, and I felt the weight of his words hang in the air. There was something deeper here, a psychological scar that went beyond the battlefield. Minutes stretched into eternity as we sat in silence. The rain continued its relentless assault on the diner's roof, and I felt as if we were trapped in a moment frozen in time. After what felt like an age, he finally spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can go now. It's safe." I hesitated, unsure of what to say or do. Part of me wanted to stay, to learn more about this young Marine and the demons he carried, but I could also feel the urgency of the hour. I stood up slowly, the diner feeling more claustrophobic by the minute. "Thank you for the conversation," I said, folding the napkin with my information and leaving it on the table. "If you ever need someone to talk to," he didn't let me finish. "Just go," he urged, his voice a mix of desperation and relief. "Please." As I walked out into the storm, I glanced back one last time. He was watching me leave, a mixture of hope and sorrow etched on his face. I turned away and headed for my truck, the rain soaking through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. I climbed into the cab, the engine rumbling to life as I tried to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. I took a deep breath, hoping to drown out the echoes of our conversation. The night felt heavier now, the weight of the memories shared hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. As I drove through the downpour, the wipers struggled to keep pace with the rain, blurring the world outside into a watery haze. I couldn't shake the feeling of being drawn back to that booth, the young Marine's haunted eyes, and his promise lingering in my mind, like a ghost refusing to let go. I had never met anyone quite like him. His presence felt familiar yet unsettling, as if he carried the weight of untold stories, each one more chilling than the last. Every mile felt like an eternity, and with each turn of the road I replayed our conversation. The rain beat relentlessly against the truck, a backdrop to the haunting narrative he had shared. As I drove on, the landscape transformed, a blur of dark trees and distant lights that barely pierced the curtain of rain. My thoughts drifted back to the Marine's promise, a promise that felt like it was rooted in the past yet reverberated in the present. The road stretched ahead, illuminated only by the truck's headlights, and the rain began to lighten, but the atmosphere felt thick with an unshakable tension. I turned the radio on, hoping for some distraction, but the static only served to heighten my sense of unease. As I focused on the road, a shadow passed in my peripheral vision, causing my heart to race. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just a trick of the light or reflection perhaps. But then the shadow returned, darting through the trees lining the road. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my mind racing back to the stories I had heard over the years, scary truck tales whispered among drivers about things that lurked in the dark, waiting for the unwary. I shook my head, trying to push those thoughts aside. I was just tired, the remnants of that conversation hanging like a fog over my thoughts. A few miles down the road, I pulled into a rest area, seeking to clear my head. The rain had finally slowed, but the sky was still overcast, casting a dull glow over everything. I stepped out of the truck, the cool air washing over me. As I moved to stretch my legs, I noticed a figure standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the same unsettling sensation I had experienced in the diner. "Hey!" I called out, trying to pierce the silence that hung heavy in the air. The figure turned slowly, revealing a young man, soaked but standing tall, his eyes reflecting the faint light. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice firm despite the unease creeping in. The figure took a step forward, and as he stepped into the light, I froze. There was something eerily familiar about him. He looked just like the Marine, but the expression on his face was hollow, void of life. "Come with me," he said in a voice that echoed with a resonance I couldn't place. My heart raced, instincts screaming at me to run, yet I felt anchored in place, unable to move. "What do you want?" I managed to stammer, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. "It's time to remember," he replied, a hint of urgency in his tone. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, realizing the shadows around him were thickening, creeping forward like tendrils seeking to ensnare me. Before I could react, a sharp flash of lightning lit the sky, illuminating the figure for just a moment. His eyes, those same haunted eyes I had seen in the diner, bore into me, a silent plea mixed with a heavy burden of sorrow. With that fleeting moment of clarity, the image of the Marine flashed in my mind, his voice echoing, "You can go now. It's safe." I turned and ran back to my truck, heart pounding, the adrenaline surging through my veins. As I climbed into the cab, I slammed the door shut, locking it against the darkness outside. The engine roared to life, and I sped off, the rain slapping against the windshield as I left the rest area behind, feeling a sense of dread settle in the pit of my stomach. Hours later, I pulled into a truck stop, the familiar glow of the neon sign offering a momentary sense of relief. As I stepped inside, the warmth enveloped me, but the weight of the earlier encounter still clung to me like a damp cloak. The smell of greasy food and coffee filled the air, but I had lost my appetite. I found a corner booth, hoping to gather my thoughts. The diner was filled with the usual truckers and late-night travelers, the hum of conversations mixing with the sound of clinking utensils. But no matter where I looked, I couldn't shake the image of the Marine from my mind, the haunted expression, the weight of the stories he carried, and that chilling figure in the shadows. The waitress approached, her smile warm, but I could see concern in her eyes. "You all right, hon? You look a bit pale." I forced a smile, nodding. "Just a long night." As she filled my coffee cup, I glanced around the diner, searching for something to ground me. And then, across the room, I spotted a newspaper on the counter. The headline caught my eye. "Mysterious disappearance. Local Marine vanishes without a trace." My heart sank as I read the article. It detailed the disappearance of a Marine who had gone missing exactly a year ago, just days after returning home from deployment. The article described how he had been seen at various truck stops, but each time he seemed disoriented, haunted by something he couldn't escape. The waitress noticed my reaction and sat down across from me. "You know him?" "I met him tonight," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I recounted the story of our conversation, leaving out the shadows and the eerie figure that had haunted me. "He was waiting for someone, a friend." She frowned, concern etched on her face. "You know, they say sometimes the spirits of those who didn't make it home linger in places like this, looking for closure, or maybe just a way to tell their stories." I shook my head, the weight of her words heavy. He felt real. "Sometimes they are," she replied softly. "The connection can be strong, especially for those who've seen what he has." The words hung in the air, and I felt a chill creep up my spine. I glanced back at the newspaper, the picture of the Marine staring back at me, and a realization settled in my gut. That Marine, he was still searching for answers, for someone to remember him, for someone to break the cycle of pain. The promise he made to meet someone wasn't just a passing sentiment. It was a plea for acknowledgement, a wish for his story to be heard. As I left the diner, I felt a sense of urgency wash over me. I had a duty now, a promise of my own to fulfill. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and I climbed back into my truck, determination fueling me. I would find a way to honor his memory, to tell his story. The journey ahead was still shrouded in uncertainty, but I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't forget the young Marine who had shared his truth with me that night, and perhaps in doing so I could help him find peace. Can you imagine driving for hours in complete isolation, only to witness something that defies explanation? This video dives into the most spine-tingling true trucker horror stories, offering insights that could change your perspective on long hauls forever. If you think you're ready for whatever the night throws at you, Wait until you hear what some drivers have faced, because ignoring these tales might leave you unprepared for your next journey. Stick around to discover the shocking details that are sure to haunt your future drives. Driving through northern Manitoba was always a solitary experience, especially on those long stretches of road where the landscape seemed to go on forever. The flat, straight paths cut through dense bush, and the only sounds I could hear were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the truck. It was the kind of quiet that could make a person feel both relaxed and uneasy. As the rain tapped gently against the windshield, I switched on the radio, hoping to catch a familiar voice or some music to keep me company. The night had settled in, wrapping everything in a cloak of darkness, when I noticed a shadow in the distance. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks, but as I got closer, it became clear that something was crossing the road ahead. My heart raced as I realized how large it was, easily towering over the hood of my truck. It wasn't shaped like any animal I recognized. It was too tall and slender, moving with a strange grace that sent a chill down my spine. I strained to see more details, but the creature vanished into the thick brush before I could make sense of what I had seen. As I drove past the spot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something beyond my understanding. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a knot formed in my stomach. I turned up the radio to drown out the unease creeping in, hoping it was just a bear or some large animal that had wandered too close. But deep down, I knew better. Days later, I heard a tow truck driver sharing his own unsettling experience on the radio. He described a similar creature with a clarity that made my skin crawl. He was adamant about what he saw, insisting that it was Bigfoot. The way he spoke, trying to assure everyone he wasn't crazy, only heightened my anxiety. I listened closely, absorbing every detail as he recounted his encounter, wondering if what I saw was the same thing. The eerie familiarity of his story felt like a warning, threading a sense of dread into my thoughts. Curiosity gnawed at me, so I asked an Aboriginal client about it during the delivery. He leaned back, thoughtful, as he recounted the elders' tales. To them, these creatures were just part of the natural world, spoken about in the same breath as moose and deer. They weren't to be feared. They were simply another aspect of life in the bush. Yet, standing there in that moment, I didn't know what it was, but I was sure it wasn't a bear, moose, or elk. It left me with an unsettling question. What the hell did I encounter that night? The next week I found myself back on that same stretch of road, a little more aware of my surroundings. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, and the rain began again, creating a rhythmic patter that drowned out most other sounds. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the trees that loomed like silent watchers along the roadside. The truck felt like my only refuge in this vast, empty world. Yet, the memory of that creature lingered like a shadow, a whisper that haunted my thoughts. As I drove deeper into the bush, the air felt thick, heavy with an unshakable tension. The radio crackled with static, making the silence feel even more oppressive. I turned it off, letting the sound of the rain fill the cab. Just then, a flash of movement caught my eye. I gripped the steering wheel, peering into the dark. It was nothing, just a trick of the light, I convinced myself, but the unease crept back, curling around my mind like a cold fog. The further I went, the more I felt something was off. It wasn't just the memories of my previous encounter. It was as if the very air around me shifted, thickening with an unseen presence. I remembered the tow truck driver's words, and wondered if he had felt it too. Maybe it was paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally, whispering secrets just out of reach. My thoughts raced as I focused on the road, trying to ignore the prickling sensation at the back of my neck. I decided to pull over for a moment, hoping to shake off the growing tension. The rain drummed against the roof of the truck, a constant reminder of the isolation out here. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The forest around me felt alive, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs amplifying my anxiety. I peered into the darkness, half expecting to see the creature again, but there was nothing. Just the dark, oppressive silence of the bush. Climbing back into the truck, I started the engine, my heart pounding. I needed to push through the fear and finish my route, but with every mile, The uncertainty loomed larger, like an approaching storm. The rain intensified, and the road ahead was a murky ribbon, obscured by the downpour. I gripped the wheel tighter, reminding myself that it was just a truck drive. But the earlier encounters replayed in my mind, a scary compilation of fears that I couldn't shake off. I pressed on, not knowing if I was running from something, or just trying to prove to myself that I wasn't afraid. The rain had turned the road into a slick, winding ribbon beneath my tires. I could barely see beyond the headlights as they struggled against the downpour, the visibility narrowing with each passing moment. The tension from before clawed at my insides, and I could feel the remnants of fear lingering like a bad aftertaste. My mind raced, grappling with the fact that I was in the heart of nowhere, alone, with nothing but the sound of the rain and my own thoughts. As I navigated the treacherous turns, I kept expecting to catch a glimpse of the creature from before. Every shadow seemed to stretch and morph. Teasing my imagination, I shook my head, trying to clear it. It was just a figment of my imagination, I told myself. But then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape darting along the tree line. My heart skipped a beat. There it was again. My grip tightened on the wheel as adrenaline flooded my veins. I slowed down, peering into the murky darkness, straining to see anything that would confirm my fears. My breath hitched as the shape reappeared, darting from one tree to another with a fluidity that felt unnatural. Panic set in as the realization sank in. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks anymore. Something was out there, stalking the edge of the road just beyond the reach of my headlights. I fought the urge to scream as I pressed down on the accelerator, desperately trying to escape whatever was lurking in the shadows. Then, in a heartbeat, everything went wrong. My truck hit a slick patch, and I lost control. The wheels skidded, and I felt the truck slide sideways, the sound of metal grinding against gravel echoing in my ears. I fought against the steering wheel, managing to regain control just before I veered into the trees. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage like a drum as I pulled over, breathing heavily. The adrenaline coursing through me felt like fire. Once I calmed my racing heart, I took a moment to collect myself, still aware of the shadow lurking in the periphery of my vision. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet, allowing the rain to wash over me. But I was not alone. The silence felt suffocating, filled with the weight of anticipation. I scanned the dark outlines of trees, searching for any sign of movement. I remembered the tow truck driver's words and thought of the stories from the elders. Were those tales just old folklore? Or was there something out there, something real that I had unwittingly stumbled upon? The fear curled around me again, tighter than before, as I realized the truth. Whatever it was, it might not be finished with me yet. With the engine off and the rain pounding against the roof of the truck, I felt like a sitting duck. The shadows outside seemed to stretch even longer, and the oppressive darkness pressed in on me. I could hear the rain transforming into a symphony of nature, but I wasn't in the mood for melodies. I was on high alert. Every sound outside felt amplified, and my heart raced with every raindrop that splattered against the metal. In that moment of stillness, I contemplated my next move. It was late, and I was deep in the bush with no other vehicles around. I recalled the stories I had heard, the whispers of the creature that haunted these woods. The tow truck driver's tale echoed in my mind, mingling with the warnings of the elders. I had always respected the unknown, but now it felt as if it was looming right outside my window, waiting for me to make a mistake. The rain began to lessen, and I decided that it was time to confront my fears. I couldn't stay in this truck forever. I turned the engine back on, the familiar roar filling the silence, and I slowly pulled back onto the road. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead. I drove cautiously, every fiber of my being alert to any sign of movement. The road felt endless, as if I were driving through a nightmare with no exit in sight. Then, just as I rounded a bend, I saw it again, the shadow. This time, it was closer, standing right at the edge of the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I leaned forward, trying to make sense of the shape. It was tall and covered in a dark, shaggy coat, staring directly at me with eyes that reflected the light of my headlights. I felt a surge of panic, but there was also a strange sense of clarity. It wasn't an enemy, It was a creature just as lost in this world as I was. I took a deep breath, reminding myself to remain calm. I wasn't here to provoke it. I just wanted to get home. Slowly, I pressed the accelerator and drove past the spot, keeping my eyes fixed ahead. As I did, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and there it stood, watching me drive away. I couldn't explain what had happened, nor could I deny it. But in that moment, I felt an odd sense of peace, like I had crossed a threshold and could leave whatever haunted me behind. As I continued down the road, the tension slowly began to dissipate. I realized that sometimes the unknown is just that, unknown. The rain began to taper off, and I could see the horizon starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. I made it through the night, and the stories I'd heard transformed from sources of fear into a tapestry of shared experiences. I wouldn't soon forget the shadow in the dark, but I knew that it wasn't just a nightmare. It was a reminder of the strange, beautiful, and terrifying world we share. The rain sounds faded as I finally approached civilization. The night was over, and with it, the horror stories that had haunted me. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing that sometimes fear can lead to understanding, and understanding can pave the way to acceptance. The journey was mine, and I would carry the lessons with me as I continued my life on the road, ready for whatever else the night might hold. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.